You know, country borrowing, or if you like, external debt, is money borrowed from foreign lenders to fund particular projects that would impact the borrower's economy. Our latest borrowings date back to May 6, 2021, when President Muhammadu Buhari wrote to the Senate requesting approval for the 2018-2019 external borrowing rolling plan. The Senate approved a $5.8 billion loan request, but the organized private sector OPS has warned that the rising debt profile of the government raises serious sustainability concerns. According to the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, LCCI, the debts put a heavy burden on businesses. These fears are genuine, Yusuf.
Of course. These
fears that these continued borrowings will jeopardize our economy. The fears are genuine ones. The fears are genuine. That's what I mean.
I know there should be a limit to borrowing. Whatever you are borrowing for, there should be a limit to it. But now, when you are borrowing almost every day now.
We're not borrowing every day.
Yeah, you know what I meant. So, just last month, the National Assembly approved, another, tranche of, loan requests, for this same administration, and I seem to have lost count now how many times and it's to fund the budget. I just don't even know. I'm really afraid.
No. If you are borrowing for specific projects, the funds come and you deploy the funds to the project. You quarrel with that? We have talked, Yusuf, we have talked about infrastructure deficit in this country. So need I say more?
Yes, we know. There is no one administration that can finish the job of development. It's a continuous,
Yeah, if the previous government had done so much.
That's not, we should stop this.
I will not talk about that.
There is no one government that can finish the job.
But it doesn't say that a particular government, if it needs to borrow, should not.
You see, when economic, experts are talking, expressing their fears, when people, who are captains of industries are expressing fears, you should listen. You're talking about infrastructure. We need infrastructure. That's a good thing. We need infrastructure. Whether President Muhammadu Buhari or whoever will come after him or the people before him, none of them can finish. America and other countries, they are still developing it.
Okay.
You understand? That's the point I just want to make.
Okay.
Later I will analyze some other.
Jide, I'm not an economist, but I do know that if electricity supply is improved upon, we will go back to producing again and earning foreign exchange, which will in turn impact the local currency. I may be wrong.
No, production will positively impact, make our currency stronger, no doubt about it. When we had a lot of big corporations here, and they were thriving, the economy was better than this. The value of our currency was better than this. Talking about the 80s and 90s. Even until as recent as 2014, when this CBN governor took over, it was like 185 to $1 at the time when he took over.
Okay.
Yes, but today we know some days back they still exchange for 570. Yes, we are not producing. That is a fact. We are not producing. We need to produce a lot more. And we are also not earning enough by way of revenue. I've always argued that people should not be talking about debt to GDP ratio. They should be talking about debt to revenue ratio. Do we have the capacity, by virtue of our revenue profile, to take all of these loans and be able to pay back without it affecting infrastructure that we would be interested in putting here and there. We have a situation in which what we spend on debt servicing, that is what those who come with the argument that no, there's no big deal, let's continue to borrow. That is what they don't talk about. Have they borne in mind how much of our money goes to debt servicing? Yes. Do they think at all? If you spend that much money on debt servicing, where are you going to find money for critical infrastructure within the same budget? That means you continue to borrow money to finance the budget. There was something that I complained about earlier in the year. I said all of the countries in the post-COVID era, they are cutting their clothes
according to the quality of their cloth.
No, no quality.
What is quality?
The size of
according to the size of the cloth
that is available.
Countries went into recession. France went into recession, for example. So you don't need a huge budget size. In spite of the reality of COVID-19, Nigeria still went ahead to increase its budget. I can't see any country that has done that in the post-COVID era. People are trying to manage resources and trying to live within current realities. But in our own case, we are increasing the size of our budget, not asking ourselves where the revenue will come from. So we now, having realized that the revenue, we won't find the revenue, we are now inclined to continue to borrow to finance the budget. How much longer are we going to continue to? I'm not saying you can borrow that you can borrow money for some critical infrastructure, but to borrow money to literally run your budget, I just don't get it.
Okay,
I don't get it.
We are joined now by a gentleman. Johnson Chukwu is by definition the Chief Executive Officer of Cowrie Assets Management. Brother Johnson, I greet you.
Hi, Kacha. Good afternoon, America.
Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday to you. All right.
Thank you so much.
Brother Johnson, country borrowings, should we raise the alarms? When should the alarm bells be sounded?
I think by now we should be on the rooftop sounding an alarm bell. We should be at the rooftop sounding an alarm bell. As it stands today, we are already overborrowed or over-leveraged. If you look at our revenue, which should be the major parameter to measure your debt sustainability, your capacity to borrow, we're already using about 90% of our total revenue to pay debt, to pay interest on debt, not to pay back the principal. So what that means, we're only left with 10% to pay salaries and wages, to run government, and then to incur capital expenditure. As it stands today, for the past 4 or 5 years, every kobo that the government spent on infrastructure was borrowed. We are borrowing to pay salaries and wages of government employees. We're also borrowing to build infrastructure. But it's quite interesting to note when you asked the question, the importance of infrastructure, shouldn't we continue to borrow to build infrastructure? It sounds plausible to take it from that perspective. But the challenge is this: the government is not the most efficient utilizer of economic resources, or the most efficient manager of economic resources. If we borrow to try to build the infrastructure, as we had done in the past, we find out that we don't get the same quality that the private sector would have gotten if that infrastructure was developed by the private sector. Or we don't spend the same amount. We spend far above than the amount the private sector would have spent to build the same level of infrastructure. So we have too many wastages when the government is building the infrastructure. It worsens when the government is borrowing to build this infrastructure. So if the government does not have the revenue to build the infrastructure and must borrow, is it not better we allow the borrowing to be done by the one person who can use this money more efficiently, who can get better value for money than the person who will waste it as it stands, or who will give us suboptimal value for the money they have borrowed on our behalf? So that's the challenge we have.
Yeah, Johnson, you know, the problem is here already. It's not that they are just planning the problem. If you were a member of Mr. President's economic team, what would you tell him now?
Well, I would tell him that we need to restructure our approach to funding of capital expenditure, which is a core of the first problem, which is fundamental problem we need to address. We can no longer, as a country, continue to fund infrastructure, particularly those that are commercially viable, from budgetary allocations, because we don't have the revenue profile. So I would now advise him, let's develop a framework for the private sector to get involved in infrastructure development in the country. And if we do that, we will address the concerns you have expressed that we have huge infrastructural gap and we need to fund it so that the economy can run efficiently. Let me give you an example. The government of the country has been building Lagos-Ibadan Express Road for more than 10 years, in fact, close to 20 years. That road is just about 131 kilometers of highway. A private sector operator who has a commercial interest in the road would have built it in not more than 3 years. They would have told it if the government had entered in with the private sector and given another build, operate, and transfer, and given a concession of 25 years for the private sector to build and operate that road and return to the federal government. By now, we'll be counting down to maybe 5 years left to have a return to federal government, and the road would have provided infrastructure support for commercial activities between anybody going to the southwestern part of the country from Lagos or coming to Lagos from the southwestern part of the country. But that has not been done. We don't have the road. So much has been spent on it, and you know what happens? Every budget system, they will move and demob. Move and demob means they will give the contractor money to resume work. The contractor will spend part of that money to bring back equipment to site, bring back workers to site. That is wasted. And then the next year, because they wouldn't continue to pay the contractor, they will demobilize and go back. Whenever we want to bring them back, we pay additional costs. So that's what we've been going through. Look at another example. The second Niger bridge. In 2015, it was concession to the private sector, one of which the Nigerian Investment Authority and Ginobili and some other consortium members. And they were supposed to build that road under build, operate, and transfer. But the government reversed that concessioning and then brought it back to budgetary funding. As we speak today, this 6 years gone, the bridge has not been built. People going home to the Christmas season will still go through the same pain they go through. But that bridge would have been built in less than a year or thereabouts. And then by now, the concessionaires would have been recovering their money and they're counting down to returning the asset to the federal government. So as it stands today, we don't have the revenue profile to build infrastructure. A final example I want to mention is the telecommunications sector. If you remember the era of NITEL, NITEL had monopoly of telecommunication services. NITEL was being funded from budgetary allocation. They were building those masts. If you are politically connected, they build one around you. NITEL was a loss leader. But today, the government did not spend a dime to have telecommunication services all over the country. Rather, government is made money by licensing those telcos for $285 million for the three operators, or eventually 4 operators that acquire those licenses. The government is going to get another $286.3 million from the concessioning of 5G. If NIT had remained and the government said we're going to build the transmission grid, we're going to bring the fiber optics, we would have borrowed billions upon billions and we won't have efficient telecommunication service today. But by giving it to the private sector, are we not better off today than we would have been if we say let government build the telecommunication services around the country? Similar thing can be replicated in several infrastructure supply areas of the country.
Yeah.
There are those who say that we should have cut our quote according to the size of our clothes in the post-COVID era. Do you share such optimism? such belief that the size of the budget should have been shrunk in line with the realities that the world faces post-COVID?
Okay, I come from a slightly different perspective. In 2020 was an unusual year, at which time every government all over the world needed to spend money to save lives. So it was expected that the budget should have expanded last year, principally to invest, one, in health care services, two, to support private sector business so that they don't lose employment, so that we don't worsen our unemployment situation. So many governments gave a handout to their citizens. Many governments bailed out companies in their countries. Many governments acquired even COVID medications and COVID vaccines for their citizens, and made sure that people got the best medical service that was available. So that required probably borrowing, probably drawing from the reserve for those who are reserved. So that last year, it can be schools anywhere in the world that the government borrowed to ensure that economy did not grind to a halt, lives were saved, and people, all the companies did not throw out of their employees out of job. But subsequent years, like this year, countries are winding down that level of budgetary support that they needed last year. But unfortunately, we've not started that. In the first place, the expansion we saw in the budget of the federal government, one cannot point to and say, look, this is actually what the government spent on COVID-19 in terms of supporting households or supporting corporate organizations. A lot of the support we saw came from federal government, central bank expansionary monetary policies, as well as intervention by private sector operators like COVID. So the expansion we saw in government expenditure last year cannot really be said to be attributed to expenditure related to COVID-19 or fighting COVID-19.
Yeah.
I was even referring to some infrastructure projects that caused the size of the budget to be as big as it is, that we should have moderated things along with present day realities. That's the point that I make. I wasn't really referring to those health interventions.
In fact, the reality is that the amount we spent on infrastructure last year, I don't think it was more than 1.6 trillion naira. Of the about 10 trillion naira we spent last year. So it's inconsequential, just about 16% of what we spent in the budget. A large portion of our expansion of government expenditure is coming from non-fixed asset, non-capital expenditure, coming from recurrent expenditure, coming from debt service. We saw a steep increase in the current expenditure from government overhead last year. That's which way I said, look, unfortunately, we are not really borrowing so much, we're not investing so much in infrastructure. But even the little we are borrowing, we are investing, you really can't put your hand on it and say this justified amount we are spending in that area. There's no doubt you can't run a government without some government doing some infrastructure. There are some social infrastructure that are not commercially viable. Those are things government will spend on to improve the living standard of citizens, particularly the poorest in the society. That's a different thing. But we're saying commercial infrastructure that will catalyze economic growth, government needs to rethink how it's going to fund it. The growth we are seeing in our expenditure is not largely attributed to capital expenditure, which is very unfortunate. It's because we are seeing growth in our debt service and we are seeing growth in government provided salaries and wages in particular are all expanding.
The minister, of finance, alluded to the fact that government has had to borrow some money to pay wages of workers. Did it not come to you as a shock that in this age and time we are taking money from the CBN and using such monies to pay the wages of government workers?
You know, for me, last year, like I mentioned, there was an abnormal year. Last year, it could be excused. Subsequent years, it should not be excused. And it must be stated at this point that it didn't start last year. Government has been borrowing since 2016 to pay salaries and wages of employees. So the minister declaring that to the public knowledge is not a new thing to people like us. So and that then means that since it's a consistent trend, you cannot really say justifiably that only occurred because of COVID-19 because government revenue shrank. We already have a very difficult fiscal situation in the country, and the government needs to take drastic measures to address these challenges. If they don't take those measures, the current trend will continue. We're going to get a point not too far from now where the government will spend 100% of its revenue on payment of salaries and wages, and then we will have to go and borrow to just pay debt, and then we'll have nothing to show as a country.
The organized private sector also complain about the situation with foreign exchange, with respect to foreign exchange. As a business owner yourself, what do you think government can do at this stage to mitigate the pains that manufacturers and other categories of people go through with respect to foreign exchange?
Okay, I'll start by saying this. There is actually no easy way or short route to solving Nigeria's foreign exchange problem. We have lived with this for the past 40 years. If you recall, we used to have what they call import licensing scheme. The import licensing scheme was a method of rationing foreign exchange to importers. We've gone through turns and twists in managing our efforts. The simple reason that we're not in enough foreign exchange to meet our payment obligations. Let me give you a live example. In third quarter of this year, third quarter 2021, total export from this country was only by about 5 trillion naira. Total import was about 8 trillion naira. So you had a 3 trillion naira negative payment of trade, balance of trade. So that balance of trade means that a dollar equivalent of 3 trillion naira needed to be paid to export to those who exported in the country. And that has been the trend in the past 6 or 7 quarters. So which means the reserve we have, we are drawing on it to pay for imports we are making. And as long as your revenue from your earnings from export is not as high as your expenditure from or your payment from imports, then you are going to continue to borrow at the international level to pay your those imports. And that's the situation we have. So we need to start by, first of all, looking at our imports and look at, are they imports that we are currently incurring that we can possibly, as a result of policy, reduce. One of which is the issue of the amount we are spending on importation of petroleum products. Averagely, we spend about 15% of our total imports on fuel, about 1.8 trillion naira on fuel. And then if you add other gasoline related like diesel, you find out the amount grows to more than 2 trillion naira of the 8 trillion naira we spent on import. So that 2 trillion out of 8 trillion is already 25%. So we're spending 25% to import a product we ordinarily should be exporting. So the first thing is, how do we restructure the downstream, the Nigerian oil and gas sector, so that we begin to export refined petroleum products? At the minimum, stop importing. That's stage number one. That's an easy, low-hanging fruit, because that way you restore, you say about 25% of what we're currently spending on import. And that will help you moderate the gap you have between your import payment and export earnings. So those are the things that the government has to do. It can't. There's no. It's not going to be a light bulb effect. It's going to be, we take the right measures, and in the next 1 or 2 years we'll begin to see the impact. If we take the right measures against the downstream oil and gas sector, we're going to see the impact in the next 2-3 years. And at that point, we realize that the amount we are spending on imports will reduce, and that will begin to conserve foreign exchange. Until we do that, we're going to be begging and praying that the Almighty God will ensure that our crude price is high, and that the boys in Niger Delta allow us to produce up to 2 to 2.5 million barrels a day. If those two prayers are not answered jointly, we will be in the same, continue to be in the same situation, unless we take other measures to restructure our fiscal framework.
Yeah, Brother Johnson Chukwu, we want to thank you for your time. And I see Christmas buntings all around you. We wish you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you, and same wishes.
Thanks.
Okay then.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right then.